All right, well, we want to get back into our notes. I want to pick up where we left off. We left off talking about youth culture and how we need to be culturally appropriate. And you see the goal statement of youth ministry on the screen. The goal of youth ministry is to develop the culturally acceptable programs or appropriate programs through which every young person will hear the gospel and have the opportunity to spiritually mature. What we want to do now, since we've talked about what is culturally appropriate, and we looked at the three cultural imprints, we want to focus on that second part of that statement, through which every young person will hear the gospel. Who are young people? There is no doubt that they are a distinct people group, and I'm sure in youth ministry you've come across conversations and blogs and books and articles and messages that have touted that we have missed the boat on adolescents and have created a new demographic group that is really a phenomenon of the 21st century, which it is, and it continues to be that way, or the 20th century, I'm sorry. But this phenomenon is not just a phenomenon that's passing. It's not a fad. It is a distinct people group. And there's evidence to support that we may be heading for another one as well. But as we move into this goal statement, we have to look at who young people are. They are definitely a distinct people group. So when we look at this, I want to look at it in several different ways. Let's start talking about who is the adolescent and understanding who they are and what they're here for. So let's look at this real quick. Number one, or letter A, adolescent. It's a target group. The target group of all adolescents, all of those considered in your Jerusalem, reachable through the culture of your church. So when we talk about adolescents, we're talking about our target group. And we're going to look at some specific descriptors of that. And we've already talked a little bit about it in this class at the beginning of this course too, guys. Some adolescent ages. When we look at adolescent ages, there's a great debate often that ensues. What is early adolescence? When does adolescence begin? For the sake of our class, and we've talked about this earlier and looked at some of the descriptors of adolescence, we're going to say early adolescence begins at age 10 and moves through 13. Now, we know that physically and even socially and even culturally in the United States especially, that a 10-year-old is not necessarily looked at as a teenager. And we're not saying that that's a teenager. We're saying that's an early adolescent. That the descriptors that we use to identify an adolescent begin as early as 10 years old through the year 13. And then we move on into middle adolescence. Middle adolescence will be that age group that is 14 to 17. In some situations, you may want to expand that to 14 to 18. But for our discussions and for your paper and any testing and quizzing, we're going to look at ages 14 to 17. And then late adolescence, ages 18 to 25. Now, when we talk about adolescence, we're going to give you some descriptors here. We usually describe adolescence in 5 different categories, and so that'll help give you some dimension and understanding to the late adolescence category especially. There is a new age demographic that has risen in the 21st century, in the late 20th century, and it's called emerging adulthood, and it's where we see those really in that as young as 19 through 25 to 30 years old. We see an emerging adult, or what some have touted as prolonged adolescence. We're not going to deal with that here in this specific context, but it is something that you should note, that there is a widening gap between adolescence and high school and early college years and adulthood, which ensues with independence and autonomy. But we're not going to deal with that today. Roman numeral 2, let's look at some definitions here. One definition by Dr. Donald Joy, who was a longtime professor since the 1970s of human development and CE at Asbury Seminary there in Wilmore, Kentucky. He defined adolescence as a psychosocial period beginning with the arrival of sexual potency and extending until economic and social independence is achieved, or it should be are achieved. Well, while I think this is a pretty good definition to work with and has some strong components, especially moving towards economic and social independence, but I disagree with Joy's definition for the beginning of adolescence. He posits and positions the beginning of adolescence with the arrival of sexual potency. While that is an accurate understanding of one of the physical domains of adolescence, it's only one aspect of adolescence, and so I think it leaves us with a little bit to fill in there, and it doesn't quite contain the whole definition. But Dr. David Miller, who was a former professor of biblical counseling at Liberty University, defined adolescence as a period of development in humans that begins with the awareness that adult privileges are due but are not given, which would also, by the way, apply to sexuality and relationships, gender roles. and ends when the full power and social status of adulthood are granted by the society. Honestly, this is just a good definition because it puts the beginning of adolescence in terms beyond a physiological change. And so I think this is a great way for us to understand it and help parents understand it, and those that work with adolescents understand that adolescence doesn't just begin because of the physiological changes that are going on. Adolescence begins when students and young people begin to understand that there are adult privileges that are due but are not given, and ends when the full power and social status of adulthood are granted by the society, which is a pretty good definition. Well, let's look at how we define adolescence in 5 different categories. The first one is culturally. When we think about adolescence, we describe it this way, that it's an entrance into a subculture, a youth culture, identifying with and accepting value systems of others in his or her subculture rather than identifying with the values of adults. This may be the best way to actually define youth. Who are youth in our culture? They are those who have their own subculture and they have their own value system and identify with that subculture rather than identifying with adults. That's a pretty good question. That puts a pretty good question mark in our minds in local church ministry is, are we moving young people to be effective in their culture while helping them progress towards adulthood, or are we equipping them just to be effective in their culture with no thought of where they're eventually going to end up? There needs to be a both and. Second, we look at sociological definitions. They're moving from dependent childhood to independent adulthood. Now, this is a very basic understanding of the sociological transition that's happening during adolescence, but really what we're talking about is moving away from depending on your parents for everything and adults for everything, and being able to take the initiative for your career, for your marriage and your family and your financial stability, as well as emotional and social stability, and to be your own person. So moving from dependence to independence, and really within the context of a local church for the Christian, it really moves into an interdependence. We move from total dependence on others to an interdependence in the sense that we rely on each other, that we bear each other's burdens, and that we lean on each other. Now, that doesn't extend to our finances to the extent that it may in other cultures, but you get what I'm trying to say. Third, definitively, we talk about the emotions, and it's a period in adolescence of self-awareness when realizing that they have an inner nature, and they search to identify that nature by asking this question, who am I? It's their emotional stability and their self-identity that they're searching to identify, to solidify. And this is a real tough one, because as youth pastors, especially for those men who serve in youth ministry, it's very easy for us to casually throw out statements, especially to young girls, that will level their self-identity when we're completely unaware of how what we're saying is having such a deep impact. But you've got to be very careful, knowing that both the boys and the girls are struggling with their own self-awareness and trying to figure out their identity and where are they most comfortable. And obviously peer pressure plays a role in that, and the media and marketing all plays a role in that. But it's a reality of adolescence. In this emotional realm. Fourth is sexually. We've already mentioned this in the definition by Donald Joy, but there's an immediate period following the youth's or teenager's ability, young person's ability to reproduce biologically. So it definitely is one descriptor of the beginning of adolescence and the period that follows. Then letter E, physically. It's a period marked by pubescence, okay? The time period involved during the maturing of the reproductive function. And we are very well acquainted with that. I'm sure most of us are. And the body not only is able to develop has not only developed the ability to reproduce, but also other glandular development in different parts of the body, as well as the metabolism and other things that begin to change, and voice and everything else. So we're looking at these 5 categories when we talk about adolescence, and really these are just cursory understandings. We delve into these a little bit more when we get into our discipleship course, Youth Development and Ministry. So as we think about this, many cultures define the young by that period beginning at puberty, okay, when you're first capable of reproduction, and ending at marriage. Today, though, many sociologists agree that young people have become a distinct people group that have capabilities of connecting even across language barriers. And let me pause right there, because when we use that term distinct people group, we're moving into a missional strategic focus, okay? They have their own uniform, language, code of conduct, and group identity as a peculiar, set-apart people. Such grouping is reinforced by school systems, structures, Legal systems regulate their conduct and influence their identity. You can see how adolescents, especially in young people, in culture and as well as in the geographic locations and in our political schemes, we have definitely identified that there is a stair step from childhood to adulthood. And our laws, as well as our general practices and our governance, have reinforced that. International organizations categorize youth for the purpose of disease control, educational concerns, and political human rights issues. Here's the deal: the adolescent phenomena, though new to human history, and there is no getting around that. It is new to human history. You can look back through Scripture. There isn't a delineated adolescent group. Now there are biblical principles that are directed towards the young, and when we define that young and look at that word even in the Hebrew, we find that it positions itself in the same age span as what we use for adolescence today. But it is a new phenomenon to human history, and it has emerged, though, as an international reality and established its own identity of the one world global community. And I've seen this after traveling in 4 or 5 different countries and training youth leaders. We have an adolescent culture about everywhere we go. Now, the age limitations on those adolescent cultures will vary from country to country, but it is definitely there. Global demographics and statisticians enable us to locate this target group because the world is young and getting younger. In 2000, I believe it was 2004, the Lausanne Conference on World Evangelism, I think it was in Bangkok, Thailand, said that the current stats of the globe, which was less than now, of course, yielded about 52% of the population being under the age of 25. So the world is young, and it's getting younger. Statistics tell us that nearly 8 of 10 people respond to the gospel before their 22nd birthday. Listen, the world is young and the most fertile mission field. We've got to locate them and give them the message of salvation while they are receptive to God's good news. So when we talk about who are in our goal of youth ministry, we talk about being culturally appropriate, understanding our 3 cultural imprints, and how to effectively span the gap, identify the culture, and use the culture to reach the culture. And we also want to make sure that through our culturally appropriate programs, every young person will hear the gospel. Now I want to pause right there because hearing the gospel can sometimes be confused. This is not just a cursory reading. Let's explain just briefly, and then we'll wrap up this session, what it means to hear the gospel. When we talk about hearing the gospel, number one, we're looking for a clear presentation of the gospel message. Now it doesn't mean that it always has to be a one-on-one experience, but we're looking for a clear presentation of the gospel message. Number two, one that is in an environment with limited distractions to allow comprehension. So it's not a hit and run gospel message. It's an opportunity. Now that may be in a youth ministry worship service on a Wednesday night or Sunday night, or maybe in a small group setting on Wednesday or on a Sunday morning, or in a home group during the week. It may be in various environments, but there needs to be limited distractions appropriate for the environment to allow for a student to understand the gospel message. Number three, there needs to be a clear opportunity for a voluntary response. Now, I want to clarify what I mean by voluntary response. As I have spoken in summer camps and retreats and mission trips and for teenagers for years in local church ministry, it's compulsive for us at times to want students to respond to the truth of God's word, and sometimes we can be quite coercive in our encouragement to where students who just want to please will respond. We have to be careful, but we also don't need to be so careful that we don't give them an opportunity to respond. We need to give them a clear opportunity for a voluntary response, not one that says the leaders are coming by and if you raised your hand they're gonna take you out of the room. But no, if God is moving and God has spoken to you, your opportunity to respond is right now, and there are leaders in the room who are willing to pray with you and to answer any questions that you may have from God's word about this, what God is speaking to you. Give them a clear opportunity for a voluntary response. And then number four, a fair hearing of the gospel simply means this. It means there needs to be adequate support for counseling or guidance, both in the moment and following the moment. So when we look at our goal statement, and we specifically want to look at it, we see these 4 things right here. A clear presentation of the gospel message, limited distractions to allow comprehension, offering a clear opportunity for a voluntary response, and then finally, adequate support for counseling and for guidance. Well, when we have the goal statement of youth ministry, as we've already stated, we said the goal statement is to provide culturally appropriate programs where every young person can hear the gospel and then finally have the opportunity